Hello students, welcome to the fourth part in our online chemistry series. We have now finished with the basic chemistry and are going to move on to specifically the biochemistry, so more specifically about what's going on inside our bodies and the bodies of other living organisms like us. This particular lecture is going to focus on just kind of defining biochemistry and then looking at the different inorganic compounds that we find in our body. So what is biochemistry? It is essentially the study of every chemical reaction that takes place inside a living body. Every kind of chemical, every molecule, every atom inside an actual living organism, hence the bio part of the biochemistry. Every chemical inside a living organism is classified as either an organic chemical or an inorganic chemical. Inorganic compounds are things that don't contain carbon. So water, lots of different types of salts, many of the acids and bases that we find in our body, calcium phosphate crystals are inorganic, carbonic acid is inorganic, water of course, things like that. There's not really any carbon in them. Organic carbon compounds are things that contain carbon. The two exceptions to that are carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, which are not considered organic. They are considered inorganic. But what we're really talking about are what we call the big biomolecules: carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. These all contain carbon. The carbon is covalently bonded, and all of these compounds are very large molecules that are basically the major structure of our body. But both inorganic compounds and organic compounds are essential for our bodies to function properly. This particular one is going to focus on the inorganic compounds. So let's talk about water first. Water, of course, is one of our survival needs, and it is by far and away the most abundant inorganic thing in our bodies. 80% of the volume of our cells is just nothing but water, water, water. And it's also the most important of our inorganic compounds. Because of those special properties that water has, because of its ability to form hydrogen bonds, it makes it really an incredibly vital thing for pretty much everything living on our planet, with rare exception. So let's go over some of those really cool special properties of water. For one, it has a high heat capacity. This means that it can absorb and release heat without causing a huge temperature fluctuation in itself internally. So that means it really resists really sudden changes in temperature. It makes it a really, really good inorganic compound to comprise most of our cell volume. It helps us kind of maintain our body temperature. It also has a very high heat of vaporization. It requires a ton of heat to evaporate. And so when we sweat and the sweat evaporates off our body, that requires a ton of heat. And so it uses the heat of our body to evaporate, and that's cooling us off as an evaporative cooling mechanism, as part of our negative feedback that maintains homeostasis for us. It's also polar, right? It forms hydrogen bonds. And so because it's polar, anything ionic will dissolve in it, so it makes water our universal solvent. Water also tends to form what we call hydration layers. Anything that's really large, a charged molecule, gets this kind of like protective coat of water around it. So it makes it our universal solvent. It makes it our transport medium. Like I said, our blood is like almost 98% water. So incredibly useful stuff is water. Again, here's to kind of remind us what water molecules look like, and you can see here's our little salt crystals, and they will dissociate and kind of become an ion in solution instead of the whole salt crystal. Water is also incredibly reactive. It's a huge part of the hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis reactions that make our big biomolecules, and it's a great cushion. Think about a waterbed or a water balloon. We talked about the serous membranes that are full of fluid, like a water balloon around your heart. Well, you have several different organs that have these kinds of cushions of water, like your brain, that's an incredibly vital one, around these different organs, which helps protect them from physical trauma. So water is really cool. We are definitely in big trouble if we don't have water. Salts are the other inorganic compounds. These are ionic things that will dissociate into ions in the water. So these ions are what we call electrolytes. They conduct electrical currents in solutions like we find in our body, and they play a lot of specialized roles in many of our body functions, particularly sodium and potassium. Those are two of the major electrolytes that are responsible for probably more than you will expect. And if these electrolytes, if these ions are not in balance, then really crazy things happen. So keeping them in balance is absolutely vital for homeostasis. And there are several different organ systems that contribute to the ion balance of our bodies. The last of the inorganic compounds in our bodies are acids and bases. These are also electrolytes, so they will ionize, they will dissociate in water. So acids are the proton donors. They will give up a hydrogen ion in solution. So you can see the hydrochloric acid here will dissociate into hydrogen ions and chlorine ions. Bases are what we consider proton acceptors. They will take up hydrogen ions from a solution. And so here you have NaOH dissociating into a sodium ion and a hydroxyl ion. That hydroxyl ion can then kind of accept an available proton, and we get water at the end of it. So this is the pH scale. I'm guessing most of y'all have seen this before. This is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration right here. And so things that are less than 7 are considered acidic. Things that are higher than 7 are considered basic or alkaline, and 7 is considered neutral. If we look at our blood, you can see that its pH is roughly 7.4, which means our blood is slightly basic. I hope everybody feels pretty comfortable with a pH scale. When acids and bases combine, what we get very often is something called neutralization. We get at the end of the reaction water and some sort of salt. And that's what you're seeing here with this, what we call a titration curve. You can see at this point here, what we call the equivalence point, we have about equal amounts hydrochloric acid and equal amounts sodium hydroxide, and they've basically canceled each other out. These are displacement reactions that result in the production of water and some sort of salt. Kind of neutralizes or pulls the teeth out of, invalidates the acids and bases, because anything that's too acidic or too basic can harm our body. pH is really vital for maintaining homeostasis. It has major issues with how our cells function. It can actually damage your body if your body gets too acidic. So even really small changes in pH can result in fatalities. We have a very narrow range at which our body functions in terms of acid base, and anything beyond that, we're in really big trouble. let's talk about buffers for a second. Buffers consist of a mixture of an acid and a base. So they have acidic components and basic components. And these are one of the ways that our body regulates our pH, along with our kidneys and our respiratory system. And essentially what they are is these mixtures of acids and bases that really resist really large changes in pH. The reason they're a mixture of both an acidic component and a basic component is that the acidic component can act like an acid if the pH gets too high and release hydrogen to kind of tamp down on the baseness, and the basic component can take up hydrogen if the pH decreases, if it gets too acidic, so it gets to act like a base. The most important of the buffering systems in our body is something that we call the carbonic acid bicarbonate system, and it is an incredibly important system to maintain the pH of our blood. And so you can see it consists of carbonic acid and then bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is the base that will take up hydrogen ions if the blood gets too acidic, and carbonic acid here is the weak acid that will release hydrogen ions if the pH rises and if it becomes too basic. And that is the end of this part of the lectures.